excited to come to you today and spend a few minutes with you on some verses in the Bible. But first, let me just talk about this weekend. Many of you are going to go to maybe a high school football game, or maybe a college football game, or even an NFL game. I know several that are going to a Kansas City Chiefs game. And so those games are played in buildings, outdoor venues that normally we call a stadium or a coliseum. And we get those buildings and we get kind of the footprint and how those buildings are laid out, even all the way back before Christ. The Greeks had different Olympiads, and they had different events that went on inside of those buildings and outdoor arenas. They had like wrestling, they had javelin, they had shot put, they had discus, they had the 100, the 400 dash, the mile race. They had all these things, and they also had obstacles. They, much like what we would see in the spring at our high schools and our colleges, their track events. And so as Paul in the first century and the first century Christians and Timothy, as they were watching these things, I can only imagine that Paul went, I might be able to use this someday as an illustration. And Paul was a master at illustrations. And so as he wrote about this in the Bible, and of course the Bible is full of illustrations, and that's what makes it so practical. That's what I love about the Bible. And so Paul, as he wrote about this in 2 Timothy 4:7, he says this. He says, I've fought the good fight, and I've finished the course, and I've kept the faith. And so as Paul's talking about that, in that era, the first century Christians and Timothy, as he read that letter that Paul was writing to him, and then of course Timothy would have read that letter to the other Christians in that time, they would have understood what that meant. They would have known a little bit about Paul. They would have known that, yes, he did wrestle. He wrestled with Pharisees, government officials, sometimes the Jews, and even sometimes the disciples, as he was trying to put forth what he believed that God had laid upon his heart to share with those that they needed a Savior, and his name was Jesus Christ. And so as Paul continued to share that, these first century Christians, they would have understood that. They would have seen what that wrestling meant. Then the next part is, I've finished the course. They would have noticed the 100-yard dashes and all those different things, but they would also notice the obstacles. You know, in the spring when we see those track events, there's high hurdles, there's low hurdles, and sometimes I've even seen pits in the ground where they had water. In the first century, they probably didn't have that, but they probably had rocks. They had anything and everything they could to have obstacles out there in front of the runners, but they had to go over those obstacles. They couldn't go around those obstacles. They had to go over them. And so as Paul was sharing that with them, they got the picture. And then just there at the very end where Paul shares, and I've finished the race, and I've kept the faith. And so as Paul finishes that and says that he kept the faith, he did it, and he did it well. And so as we kind of wrap up today with this devotion, I want you to think about that, looking at the race through that view of what we're talking about. The spiritual race is what Paul was talking about there. Think about that as we continue to run hard the rest of this year. Run hard by sharing the gospel with people that are around you. Run hard with inviting people to different events that we have here at First Arnold, like Lights of Christmas coming up. Just in the Christmas holiday messages that Pastor Kenny has coming up. That's how we're going to run hard and run well. But you might be thinking, hey, Mark, as Paul talked about wrestling and as he talked about finishing the course, how do I do that? And how do I do that well, Mark? Well, one of those things is by using one of the four letters of our G's: gather, grow, go, glorify. So we're going to talk about gather. Some of that's going to be gathering in a small group. That's getting in a small group and transforming through the reading of the word, by community in that group, and also by serving missionally. Now, you might do that in a Sunday morning. You might do that in something during the week. If you're working on Sunday and can't make it here, totally get that. Totally understand. We have all kinds of different ways where you can get involved in a small group and gather with others. And so as we finish up with this, man, as we think about running hard, run hard. I want to challenge you. Run hard through the rest of this year. Don't stop at what we consider the end of fall, which I think is December 23rd. It's a date on the calendar, but run hard. Run through that finish line. Run into the 2023, into the winter, and continue to build that faith that God has planted in your heart.